Welcome to Deep Sleep Tales. Tonight, as every night, there is a story here waiting for you, woven from quietness, patient and unhurried, holding still until you are ready to receive it. A story that will carry you, gently, gradually, into the deepest silence that only night can offer. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps in your bed, the covers pulled warm across your chest. Perhaps in a small room in a distant city, rain finding its way to your window. Wherever you are, share it with me in the comments, because those small notes arriving from every corner of the world are what make this channel feel like a community rather than just a voice in the dark. If these stories bring you stillness, consider subscribing so each new one can find you quietly, softly, exactly when you need it. Now, the time has come. Settle into your bed, let your shoulders drop, let your eyes close. Draw a slow breath, deep and unhurried, and release it even more slowly. Whatever today held, let it leave with that breath. The day is finished. There is nothing left of it that requires you. Only listen and let my voice carry you gently toward a calmer hour, a quieter town, an evening when the lamps are just beginning to be lit. In the February of 1891, on the southwestern coast of England, where the wind-scoured lands of Dorset lean at last into the sea, there existed a small town called Whitmore Cove. It appeared on maps only at their edges, the kind of place that cartographers seemed to forget mid-stroke, and most of the world had never heard its name. But for those who lived there, it was not on the edge of anything. It was the center, because any place for the person who has made their life within it becomes the center of the world. The town's main road, Harbor Lane, climbed from the harbor in a long, unhurried rise of cobblestone, narrow enough that two carts could not pass without one yielding to the other. On either side, stone houses stood pressed together like old friends who had long since stopped needing to speak, each built in a different decade, some the color of pale straw, some the gray of overcast mornings, and some worn to a shade that had no name, the green-gray of sea salt and centuries in quiet moss. They did not look as though they had been built. They looked as though they had simply been there, shouldering the weather together, since the beginning of things. Midway along this street, wedged between a bakery and a haberdasher's, stood a narrow stone house of 2 stories. Its upper floor held a single window that faced the street, and this window had long since become a kind of landmark, not on any map, but in the memory of everyone who walked Harbor Lane after dark. For each evening, as the sun drew itself down behind the sea, that window came alive with lamplight, a warm amber-tinged glow that spilled onto the cobblestones below and gathered there like a small pool of gathered heat, faithful as a night watchman, lasting until morning. That window belonged to Mrs. Constance Ashwell. Constance was 62 years old, slight of frame, with a stillness about her that was not the stillness of emptiness, but of someone long settled within themselves. The lines on her face were not the marks of exhaustion, but of weather endured and seasons witnessed, a face that had seen much and broken against none of it. Her hair was entirely white, gathered each evening into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. In lamplight it turned silver, as though the flame recognized something in it. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, seen through glass, attentive, unhurried, holding everything they rested on without the weight of judgment. And her hands were a seamstress's hands. Years of needle and thread and cloth had left faint calluses at the fingertips, yet they remained precise, careful, the hands of someone who had learned that every detail matters, and that haste is merely a slower route to mistakes. That evening, as every evening, Constance came into the sitting room as the last of the day's light thinned at the window. She moved without hurry, crossing to the small table at the room's center, where the oil lamp waited. It was an old lamp, made of brass polished by years of handling rather than by effort, its base decorated with a ring of small raised flowers worn nearly smooth. She lifted the glass chimney with both hands, checked the wick, and set it down again. Then she took the matchbox from the shelf, drew out a single match and struck it. The brief rasp of it, that small reliable sound, and a flame was born, orange at its heart, edged with blue, alive. She brought the flame to the wick with the patience of someone who understood that fire, like most things worth having, could not be rushed. The wick caught, timid at first, wavering, testing the air, and then it settled, burning cleanly, steadily, as though it had simply been waiting for permission. Constance replaced the glass chimney, and the light was enclosed, yellow and warm and soft, filling the room the way warmth fills cold hands. The room answered the lamp with its own quiet transformation. The walls took on the color of old honey. The mantelpiece cast familiar shadows that Constance could have drawn from memory. The rug, once vivid with deep reds and navy patterns, now faded to something gentler by decades of footfalls, looked almost rich in the lamp's forgiving light. 2 armchairs flanked the fireplace facing one another, Constance's own dark green chair, and beside it the other, wider, with worn armrests where the fabric had thinned to a pale ghost of its original color. This second chair was empty tonight, as it was every night. But it did not feel empty, not exactly. It held the shape of absence, the way a room holds warmth after the fire has gone. Something was missing, but the outline of it remained. Constance carried the lamp to the window ledge, set it in its usual place, and watched the light pass through the glass and fall upon the street below. Then she settled into her chair, drew one slow breath, and let the evening begin. In the small iron stove, the afternoon's coals gave off a last faint heat, enough together with the lamp to make the room a different world than the February street outside, a shelter, not from the cold alone, but from the larger cold of things undefined. Outside, Harbor Lane was surrendering to dusk. The western sky held the last of the day in soft oranges and a fading violet, while from the east the dark came on with the quiet certainty of a tide. The first stars appeared above the rooftops, tentative, pale, as though unsure they were welcome. Old Mr. Kettle, the lamplighter, moved along the street with his long pole, and wherever he paused, a new pool of light spilled onto the cobblestones, and the lane filled slowly, lamp by lamp, with its nightly geography of illuminated circles. The street held only a few figures now, shadows emerging from the lamplit patches and retreating back into the dark, each one navigating their own small homeward journey. Constance watched them as she always did, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to the long observer, not curious, exactly, but deeply familiar. The first she recognized was Mr. Barnaby Crow, the fisherman, returning from the harbor. He was a broad-shouldered man who seemed to carry the weather in his face. Years of sea wind had carved it into something permanently weathered and oddly calm. He moved up the hill with the unhurried tread of a man accustomed to the patience that the sea demands, his nets over one shoulder, a pail in hand. As he passed beneath Constance's window, he glanced up, just for a moment, a reflex as natural as looking for the horizon, and saw the lamp burning. A small expression crossed his face. Recognition, the quiet satisfaction of something being as it should be. Then he continued up the hill, toward his wife and his supper. Not long after, Mrs. Prudence Gale came by with her large wicker basket, the evening's purchases tucked inside. She was a woman of her middle 60s, round-faced and apparently always on the verge of hurrying, without ever quite arriving there, who stopped every few yards to catch her breath and look at something in the middle distance, as though the lane held small secrets worth consulting. Watching her, Constance remembered their Saturday mornings at the grocer's. She and Arthur both remembered how Mrs. Gale had a habit of pressing one extra apple into a basket without comment, a small generosity offered as though it were an oversight. The memory arrived gently and left the same way, drawing a brief smile behind it. Then, from the lower end of the street, a boy appeared, 8 or 9 years old, in short trousers and a wool jacket and a flat cap, running with the particular urgency of a child who has suddenly noticed that the dark is gaining. A moment later, a woman's voice came from above. "Timothy, slow down." The boy dropped from a run to a reluctant walk, and his mother descended the steps of a nearby house and reached her hand out to him. He took it without looking up, the way children take the hands they have always trusted, and they walked on together, his small shoulder almost at her elbow. Constance watched them until they rounded the corner, and something shifted in her chest, old and quiet, barely a movement. They had not had children, she and Arthur, and there had been a time when that fact had its own sharp edge. But the years had worked on it steadily, the way water works on stone, not removing it, but smoothing away what could be smooth, until what remained was not pain, but something closer to a peace that had learned to coexist with what was absent. The street emptied. Constance turned her gaze to the window glass itself, where her reflection waited in the dark, blurred at the edges, softened, like a portrait done in fog. She looked at herself for a moment without turning away. There was no verdict in it. Outside, the wind was carrying in from the sea, salt-edged, unhurried, and the sound of the waves breaking on the shore below came to her not as sound exactly, but as something felt, a low and rhythmic pulse at the floor of everything. Across the lane, windows had begun to light up, one by one. The Pettigrew's sitting room, bright and warm. Miss Arabella Finch's small curtained window. Dr. Hartley's surgery lamp, which some nights burned past midnight. Each light was a household, a life, a small self-contained world arranged behind glass, and together they formed the town's nightly constellation, each distinct, each unaware of being watched, and all of it somehow composing the place where Constance had lived for 62 years. The solitude of the room was not the solitude of abandonment, or perhaps it was, but it was hers, known and accepted, worn in the way a coat is worn, until it ceases to feel like clothing and begins to feel like skin. She did not struggle against it. She sat with it beside her, the way one sits with an old companion who has given up the need for conversation, and she looked out at the lamplit lane, and the evening continued. When Constance's eyes drifted from the window, they moved as they always did, without being directed, to the other armchair by the fire, Arthur's chair. The glance lasted only a second or two, but it was there every time, a small, silent acknowledgement, a kind of greeting, because the chair, though empty, was not simply empty. It held something that could not be upholstered away or moved out, an impression of a presence that had lasted so long it had become structural, like a beam you could not see, but upon which the whole room quietly rested. The chair was wide and deep, upholstered in dark brown velvet that had long since been shaped by the particular weight and posture of one man. The seat had softened at its center. The fabric at the armrests had worn thin and pale, the nap of it rubbed smooth by 30 years of a man resting his arms after a day of walking every street in the town. These were not signs of neglect. They were, Constance thought, the most truthful portrait a person could leave, not a painting hung with intention, but the honest record of simply having been. She had never sat in that chair after Arthur died. The two chairs remained as they had always been, facing one another, an arrangement for two, which the absence of one had not disturbed, but only made more apparent. Arthur Ashwell had been tall and spare, broad at the shoulders but carrying it lightly, with large hands that moved with a carefulness that always seemed at odds with their size. His eyes were dark brown, the warm, uncomplicated brown of turned earth, and he had been the town's postman for more than 30 years, a man who rose before the light and who knew the name of every door on every street, and who left at each one something more than the post. The memory came without announcement, and Constance let it come. April 1856, on a Sunday morning in the market square. She had been 27, newly established as a seamstress in her own right, running an errand for her mother, buttons of a specific size that only one stall carried. The night before had brought rain, and the morning was one of those mornings that follow rain, everything clean and slightly luminous, the air holding the smell of wet earth and fresh grass and bread from the bakery nearby, a smell so particular and complete that 35 years later it remained as vivid in Constance's memory as the present smell of lamp oil and old wool. She was studying the button tray, when someone bumped her shoulder, gently, not enough to matter, and when she turned, there was a tall young man with an expression caught between apology and amusement, as though he had not quite decided yet how embarrassed to be. He said sorry in a voice that had nothing performative in it. She said it was fine, and that might have been the whole of it, a moment and then nothing, but something made them both pause. They looked at each other for just a moment longer than strangers do, and in that pause there was a recognition, as though each had caught a glimpse of something recognizable in unfamiliar territory. He smiled, warm, uncomplicated, and offered to show her the button stall he had been looking for himself. The following Sunday they met again, and the one after that. What grew between them was like a first stitch on a long piece of work, a single point of connection, pulling slowly into something that would hold. They were married in September of 1857 at St. Margaret's Church, in the rain, and Constance had stepped through the church door to find Arthur already waiting, turned toward her, and in his face there was no performance at all, no ceremony beyond what was genuine, and that was everything. It was not a grand moment. It was simply true and deep, and hers, and she had kept it somewhere close ever since. The clock on the mantelpiece measured 6:30 into the silence. Constance returned from the memory slowly, the way one surfaces from deep water, without resistance, but aware of the distance traveled. Arthur had died in the winter of 1887, on a January morning, in his sleep, as quietly as he had done everything. 4 years. Time had not taken the grief away. She no longer believed it could, but it had transformed it, the way fire transforms wood, not into nothing, but into something different, something that did not burn. What had once been sharp had become deep. What had once demanded acknowledgement now simply lived alongside her, patient and permanent, and she had made her peace with the permanence of it, because letting go of the pain was not the same as letting go of Arthur. The pain could pass. The love was a different matter entirely. Constance rose from her chair, slowly, feeling the familiar mild complaint in her knees that had become as much a part of the evening as the lamp, and made her way toward the kitchen. In the corridor, the third floorboard announced itself as it always did, a low creak, the house's own voice, the sound of a building that has been lived in long enough to develop opinions. The walls of the corridor held 3 frames. The first, a small engraving of the town, Whitmore Cove seen from the hillside, every rooftop accounted for. The second, her mother's portrait, faded now to soft browns and grays, the familiar face becoming less distinct each year, like a word gradually losing its definition. The third, a frame that held nothing. It had held Arthur's photograph for years, until Constance had quietly moved it to the bedroom, finding that a constant reminder was a different kind of presence than she wanted in the hallway. But she had left the frame where it was, empty, dark, hung on the same nail it had always occupied, and she passed it now, as she passed it every day, and for just a moment her eyes went to it, the border without its center, the shape of an absence, precisely outlined. The kitchen was at the back of the house, small, low-ceilinged, its walls the color of unbleached cotton. Constance lit the small lamp on the worktop, and the room arranged itself in its familiar order. Open shelves held what the kitchen had accumulated over a life. Plain white plates used daily, a blue-flowered soup bowl that had been her mother's, and on the highest shelf, the things that were neither used nor discarded, a full dinner service for 6 that no longer served 6, objects that had outlasted the occasions that justified them, kept not from sentimentality exactly, but because putting them away entirely felt like a particular kind of acknowledgement she was not yet ready to make. She filled the kettle, listening to the water's clean sound as it rose, and set it over the stove, coaxing the coals with the poker and adding a piece of Coke. From the shelf she took the tea tin, its label worn to near illegibility, the word Darjeeling surviving in faint blueprint, and opened it. The smell of the dry leaves rose immediately, earthy, slightly astringent, the smell of every quiet evening she had ever had. Then she reached for the teapot. It was white porcelain, painted with thin blue dog roses along its shoulder, and Arthur had brought it home from Exeter one autumn, setting it on the kitchen table and saying simply, "I saw it through the shop window and thought you'd like it," and she had, immediately and completely, and she had used it every single day since, 24 years. Some days lifting it, she thought about that. The kettle came to the boil and she poured the water over the leaves, watching them turn and drift in the heat. While the tea drew, she looked out the small back window at the garden below, bare and still in the February dark, except for the old rose cane at the far wall, bare-branched, blunt-pruned, apparently dead. Arthur had planted it in their first year in the house. "This rose will open every summer," he'd said, with the calm confidence he brought to most pronouncements, and it had opened every summer since, without fail, for more than 30 years. She poured the tea into her cup, the last survivor of a dozen, its rim traced with a thin line of gold, its companions lost one by one over the years to the ordinary accidents of a used life. She held it in both hands, felt the heat travel through the porcelain into her palms, and took the first sip, slightly bitter, slightly sweet, hot enough to matter. She closed her eyes for just a moment. It was a small thing. It was enough. She carried her tea back to the sitting room and had just settled into her chair when the first drop struck the window, a single deliberate sound, like a fingertip tapped once on glass. Then the rain began in earnest, slowly at first, feeling its way, and then finding its rhythm, and within a few minutes, Harbor Lane was receiving a steady, quiet February rain, not cold exactly, but cool, not hard, but certain. Constance loved rain in the way that people love things that have always been present, deeply, without analysis, as a given. Rain slowed her thoughts. It narrowed the world to the room and the window, and the sound. The lamplight caught the water running down the glass and turned it to a series of small gold rivers, each one briefly brilliant, before it reached the sill and was replaced by another. Beyond the streaming pane, the lane had become something impressionistic, cobblestones gone dark and reflective, each one its own small mirror. The street lamps doubled in the wet stone below them. The rain brought a memory, uninvited and welcome. Autumn, 1869. She and Arthur walking along the harbor, in weather very much like this. Arthur's umbrella, large enough for 1.5 people, which meant that Constance's left shoulder was perpetually outside it and perpetually damp, and she had found she did not care in the slightest. They had walked all the way to the end of the pier, stood looking out at the sea, which was gray and restless and magnificent in the way that gray, restless things sometimes are, and Arthur had said, without irony, "What a fine evening," and Constance had laughed, because they were both thoroughly wet, and the wind was doing its worst, and Arthur had smiled back, the particular smile of a man who had genuinely meant what he said. He found beauty in such places, not in the polished version of things, but in the thing itself, weather included. The smell of his overcoat on wet evenings, damp wool and something underneath it that was simply unmistakably him, had faded gradually in the years after his death, the way sounds fade when you move away from their source, until now it lived only as a ghost of itself, conjured sometimes on evenings like this, arriving for a moment and then dissolving, leaving only the knowledge that it had once been real. Across the lane, visible beneath the eaves of the opposite house, Mrs. Pemberton's cat Tabitha sat watching the rain with the philosophical composure of a creature that has accepted the world's unreasonableness and decided to observe it rather than protest. Her eyes caught the lamplight as two small green points. Constance looked at her. The cat looked back. For a moment they kept each other company across the wet, dark street, each on her side of the glass. The rain had settled into its full, even voice when 3 knocks came from the street door below. Quiet but clear, deliberate talk, talk, talk. Always 3, never 2 or 4, always the same. Constance knew the knock before she had finished hearing it. She set down her tea, rose, and went to the stairs. The staircase was steep and narrow, 12 steps of dark wood, each one with its own pitch and timing, a kind of instrument that played the same small melody every time it was used. She took the banister in her right hand and descended carefully and went to the door and drew back the bolt. Mrs. Agnes Pemberton stood in the rain with a shawl over her head and a covered bowl held in both hands, and on her face the unhurried warmth that Constance had known for nearly 30 years, a warmth that did not perform itself but simply was, the way certain rooms are warm before you've quite identified why. Agnes was in her late 50s, round-faced, generously built, her cheeks perpetually carrying a color that suggested she had just come from a warm kitchen, which more often than not she had. "Good evening, Mrs. Ashwell," she said. "I made a pot of soup this evening, vegetables, the last of the garden carrots, and some potatoes, and it came out rather more than I intended, as it always does, and I thought perhaps on a cold night like this, you might be willing to take a bowl off my hands." Constance smiled. The rather more than I intended was the small fiction Agnes had maintained for years, a gentle disguise for a deliberate kindness, offered without the weight of charity, without placing the recipient in the complicated position of owing something. She made extra soup, she made extra bread. She noticed when the doctor's light was burning past midnight and left a small parcel on his step. She had never, to Constance's knowledge, presented any of this as what it was. "That is very kind of you, Mrs. Pemberton. Please come in." But Agnes shook her head, also as always. She understood the value of Constance's evenings without having been told. "Tabitha is out somewhere, and I ought to keep an ear out for her," she said, adjusting the cloth over the bowl. "I put a little thyme in it, and a bay leaf." Constance took the bowl. The warmth of it moved through her palms at once. She looked at Agnes, and what passed between them required no translation and asked for none. The particular understanding of two people who have lived near enough to one another, long enough to communicate in the spaces between words. Agnes dipped her head slightly, turned, and walked back into the rain. Constance watched her until the lamplight no longer found her, and then closed the door and carried the bowl carefully up the stairs. Back in the sitting room, she set the bowl on the small table beside her chair, lifted the cloth, and looked at what Agnes had brought. It was a deep, warm orange, steam still rising from the surface in thin threads, small leaves of thyme floating at the center. She took her spoon, silver-plated, the handle slightly darkened with years of use, and took the first mouthful. The flavor opened slowly, the sweet depth of carrot, the yielding softness of potato, the faint mineral note of celery underneath it all, and the thyme throughout like a thread pulled taut, holding it together. Constance held it in her mouth for a moment before swallowing. She thought, a bowl of soup is such a small thing. And then she thought, but it is not small at all, because someone stood in their kitchen and chose these vegetables and cut them and waited while they cooked and then walked through the rain to your door. And that sequence of small choices is among the oldest ways one person has ever said to another, "I see you. I am here." She ate slowly, the soup warming her from the inside out with an intimacy that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with where it had come from. When the bowl was empty, she leaned back in her chair and thought of Agnes, perhaps home now, perhaps at her own window, watching the same rain on the same lane. And the thought brought a particular warmth, not the warmth of company, exactly, but the warmth of knowing another life was being lived nearby, on the same street, under the same sky, and that this knowing was mutual. Community was not always proximity. Sometimes it was simply this: two people aware of one another in the dark, each kept a little less alone by the knowledge that the other was there. The soup's warmth was still in her chest when Constance's eyes settled on the small wooden console beside the fireplace, on its lower drawer, to be precise. The drawer was unassuming, a small brass handle, slightly tarnished, the wood swollen faintly from years of sea air. From the outside, nothing distinguished it, but Constance knew what it held, and on evenings like this one, when the rain was steady and the lamp was burning and the memories were moving close to the surface, Her hands sometimes found the drawer without being sent there. So it was tonight. She crossed to it, sat in the chair beside it, and drew the drawer open. The familiar wooden resistance, the quiet scrape of old joints. Inside, bound in 3 separate bundles with faded ribbon, were Arthur's letters, written during the small absences of their married life. Business trips to Exeter, to Bath, occasionally to Bristol, never more than a week away. They numbered perhaps a dozen in all. Constance had read them many times over the years, on evenings not unlike this one, and had found something different in them at each reading. This, she thought, was the nature of true letters, the kind written without caution or performance. They did not fully yield themselves on any single reading. Each return found a new layer, a detail that had been there all along but had required the reader to have lived a little more before it could be seen. She lifted the first bundle without untying it and ran her fingertips across the envelopes, feeling the paper yellowed now, softened at the edges, very faintly crinkled with age. Arthur's handwriting was on each one, her own name and address, rendered in his careful, slightly right-leaning script, every letter formed with the precision of a man who had spent his life understanding that a letter misread could mean a letter misdelivered, and that an envelope in one's hands was someone's connection to someone else. She touched the letters of her own name. Arthur's hand had touched this paper. She pressed the tips of her fingers against the ink and felt she knew it was not literal, and felt it nonetheless, something travel up through the years and the absence and the distance between his life and hers, something small and warm, arriving at her fingertips like a message sent in a language older than words. She chose one from the second bundle, not at random, but not by intention either. She let her fingers decide and found herself holding a letter dated March 1865, written from Bath. She opened the envelope with the care she gave to all things that could not be replaced, unfolded the 2 sheets of paper, and held them in the lamplight. Dear Constance, it began, as always, only this. Not my darling, not my love, just dear Constance, steady and plain, the written equivalent of the way he said her name aloud, which had always made her feel not adored in the breathless sense, but known, which she had come to understand was better. The journey took longer than expected. The train waited at Yeovil for half an hour, no explanation given. I watched the fields through the window and saw lambs. The first of the year, I think. Small, unsteady, very white. Spring is coming. The inn where I'm staying is warm enough, with a small fireplace in the room, but I confess I cannot get the fire to behave. It is either too large or too small. You have some gift in this matter that I entirely lack. I would say you are a kind of sorceress, but you would tell me it is only patience, and you would be right, and I would probably make the same mistake again tomorrow evening. Constance smiled at this, genuinely, without effort, because he had been right on both counts. It was patience, and he had always been in a hurry with fire. He had brought the same impatience to bread, to certain kinds of weather, to any situation that required waiting. She had loved this about him, not in spite of it, but as part of it, as she had loved all his particular shapes, not because they were admirable, but because they were his. Loving someone, she had decided over the course of a long and careful life, was not a matter of approving of them. It was a matter of accepting the full weight and dimension of a particular person and finding that weight, that dimension, irreplaceable. The letter continued. The meeting, the streets of Bath, a bookshop he had gone into and then left without buying anything because nothing quite seemed right. And then, toward the end, the handwriting changed almost imperceptibly, slightly slower, slightly more deliberate. The house must be very quiet now. I am out here among people and meetings and noise, and the house must be so quiet. I find that thought troubling sometimes, picturing you there in the silence. But then I remember that you are not someone's silence troubles. You have always been at home in it in a way I have never quite managed, and so I picture you instead in the window, with the lamp, in your usual place, and the picture is peaceful, and I stop worrying. Constance lowered the letter to her lap when she had finished reading it. She sat for a while with it resting there, listening to his voice in the words, his actual voice, the tone and pitch of it, which she had never lost, not in 4 years, not in the 10 years before his death, when his voice had begun to quiet with age. Some voices, she thought, live in the memory, the way music lives, not as a recording, but as something the mind simply knows how to reconstruct, returning it whole and correct each time it's needed. His voice was the last thing she expected to forget. She suspected it might be the last thing she forgot of anything. She refolded the letter with the same creases it had always held, the exact folds Arthur had made in March of 1865, the paper remembering its own history in those thin white lines, and returned it to its envelope. The bundle went back into the drawer, arranged as it had been, and she closed it with a quiet click of wood against wood. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The letters were in the drawer. The memories were in her. Arthur had been gone for 4 years, but every word he had written remained. Precise, alive, entirely his. Each letter was a kind of small amber, preserving something that had no business lasting as long as it had, and lasting anyway. She was grateful for them, not in the large dramatic sense, but in the way she was grateful for warmth, and for tea, and for the sound of rain when she was indoors. Quietly, steadily, as a matter of daily fact, Constance turned back to the window. The lamp stood on its ledge, casting its steady amber light through the glass and into the street, small, reliable, patient, like a lighthouse that had given up expecting ships, but continued to shine out of a kind of principle. She thought tonight about the lamp, about why she lit it every evening without fail, and what she meant by it, and whether meaning was even the right word for something that had moved beyond intention and become simply part of what the evening was. When Arthur was alive, the lamp had been practical. He came home late sometimes from a council meeting, from a distant farm at the end of a long postal route, and the lamp in the window was his signal. I am here. The house is warm. There is tea. She had always placed it there on those evenings before she knew when he would return, and it had served as his last landmark on the journey home, the light that told him the door was near. After he died, she had gone on lighting it. The first night she had not thought about it. Her body knew the ritual, when her mind was too stunned to. The second night, the third, a week, a month, and then it was no longer possible to stop, not because she was waiting for Arthur. She was not. She was not someone who refused to know what she knew, but because the lamp had become something else. It no longer pointed toward anything specific. It simply said, I am here, without the rest of the sentence, without the object, simply the statement of a continued presence, a life going on, an evening being had behind this glass. I am still here. And she lit it because it was true, and because lighting it made it more true, and because some things are done without being asked for reasons, and are nonetheless entirely reasonable. The town had come to know it. Mr. Crow's glance upward, and the brief expression that crossed his face. She thought of that each time she settled into her chair. She had not lit the lamp for the town, but the town had received it. The lamp had become part of the street's vocabulary, one of the small fixed things that gave the lane its particular character. And this too felt right, not grand, just right. The rain had softened to a whisper against the glass when another memory arrived, different from the others in some quality she had never been able to name. It was the one she opened least often, the one she held most carefully, the way one handles a very old, very fine piece of cloth, with both hands, with full attention, knowing that some things are damaged, not by neglect, but by too much touching. Christmas Eve, 1883, 4 years before Arthur died. Nothing had happened. This was the essential fact of the memory. Nothing had happened. No guests, no gifts, no ceremony. Only the two of them in this room, in these 2 chairs, on either side of a real fire, proper logs, and the sound of them settling and breathing in the heat, 2 cups of tea on the table, perhaps biscuits, she was no longer sure. And outside, snow-deep, unhurried snow, the kind that does not blow, but simply descends, covering Harbor Lane in a silence so complete it seemed less like absence of sound than presence of something else. They had sat together for perhaps 2 hours and not spoken at all. Arthur had tended the fire at intervals. Constance had drunk her tea. The snow had continued. The clock had measured the time in small discrete intervals, and neither of them had paid it any attention. They were simply there, together, occupying the same warmth, breathing the same air, sharing a silence that needed nothing added to it. When Constance thought of that evening, she felt something in her chest expand, as though the memory itself were larger than the space she normally kept for it, too large for the body and requiring a moment to accommodate. Joy, perhaps, or peace, or the purest form of love she knew. Love stripped of all its ornament, love that had given up the need to demonstrate itself and simply was, present and unhurried as the snow falling outside, as the fire doing its work inside, as two people at the end of a long shared life, sitting together in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of their continued existence in the same room. The world had not recorded that evening. No newspaper noted it. No history would ever require it. Only Constance held it now, and Arthur, wherever he was, if he was anywhere, might hold it still. But here in this room it was entirely hers, and the responsibility of that, to remember, to carry, to keep it from disappearing entirely from the world, was one she accepted without the smallest reluctance. Before he went to bed, Arthur had risen from his chair and come to hers, and leaned down and pressed his lips very gently against her forehead. One breath's duration, dry and warm. He had said good night, just that, nothing more, and gone to the bedroom, and Constance had stayed a little longer beside the fire, with the snow still falling and the warmth still holding, and the place on her forehead where his lips had been, still present, still warm, as though the body had decided to remember by keeping. Tonight in 1891, Constance raised her fingers to her forehead, lightly, and touched the place. There was nothing there, of course, only her own skin, as it had always been. But the memory was there, below the surface, patient, whole, and she smiled, quietly in the direction of the fire, and it was sufficient as a prayer. The rain had stopped. She became aware of it all at once. The absence of what had been continuous, and the resulting silence felt briefly strange, the way any constant sound leaves a gap when it ends. She looked up toward the window, and the lane below wore the rain's aftermath cleanly, the cobblestones dark and glittering, each stone offering back a small distorted version of the lamplight above it, the whole street running gold. And then, as she watched, the clouds began to move. They thinned and separated, pulled apart by some high unfelt wind, and between them, first dimly, then with increasing certainty, the moon appeared. A half-moon, sharp-edged and white, suspended in a clear gap of sky, casting light of an entirely different character than the street lamps below, cool and silver and precise, laying itself over the lane and the rooftops and the wet stones with the indifference of something that illuminates without caring what it illuminates. Two kinds of light now occupied the town simultaneously, the warm amber of the street lamps, close and human, and the cool silver of the moon, vast and disinterested, and together they gave Harbor Lane a beauty that neither could have produced alone. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 8 small clear notes. Constance counted them, as she always did. Across the lane, lights and windows had been going out one by one. The Pettigrew's sitting room was dark. Miss Finch's window, dark. Only Dr. 70. Hartley's light still burned, a late consultation, or notes written in the quiet hours, and Constance's own lamp in the window, 2 lamps left in the lane, the night's last sentinels. The wind had died with the rain, and in the stillness that remained, sounds carried more clearly than they had before, the brief singular bark of a dog somewhere up the hill, and then silence, and then return to its rightful prominence after being muffled by the rain, the sound of the sea, waves finding the shore, drawing back, returning, a rhythm so slow and regular It barely registered as sound anymore, more like a pulse, a breathing, the tide attending to its own inexhaustible work, wave by wave, tonight as it had for longer than the town or anyone in it had existed, and as it would when they were all equally gone. Against the window's lower corner, a fine condensation had formed, the meeting point of the room's warmth and the night's cool, given visible form, a thin veil of moisture beating on the glass, lit faintly from within, each small droplet a point of light. Constance looked at it and thought that even the cold had its own small beauty, and that a house warm enough to make its own weather at the edges of itself was a thing worth being grateful for. She looked past the rooftops to where the sea was visible, a narrow strip, dark and silver, between two chimney stacks. Looking at the sea at night had never seemed, to Constance, like looking at a thing. It was more like a posture of the mind, a particular quality of openness that the sea seemed to require and reward. Not thought, exactly, but the willingness to let thought arrive and depart on its own terms. She allowed that now, watching the silver strip in the gap between rooftops, and thoughts came as they came. Arthur, briefly, the morning ahead, the summer and the roses, her mother, nothing at all, and she followed none of them, and refused none of them, letting them move as clouds move across the kind of sky that does not hold them. The sea had always taught her patience, though she had not asked for lessons. The tide did not deliberate. It did not grow weary of repetition. It had been striking the same shore since long before the town existed, in exactly the same rhythm, without urgency, without apology, and without the slightest indication that it found this monotonous. Constance had always found something steadying in this, the dignity of repetition, the grace of consistency. Her own life was full of repetition, the same lamp, the same window, the same tea, the same chair, and she had long since understood that this was not poverty, done with attention, done with care, done for reasons that had outlasted their explaining. Repetition was not tedium, it was ritual, and ritual was what held a life together, from the inside. Arthur had loved the sea too, odd perhaps for a postman, a creature of lanes and letterboxes and thresholds, of terra firma and known routes. But on their evening walks he would always angle toward the harbor, and they would stand at the end of the pier looking out, and once, on such an evening, he had said, "The sea is saying something, but I don't think we're meant to understand it. I think we're only meant to listen." She had not forgotten it. She thought of it now, here, in the lamplit room, and thought, yes, some things are not for understanding, they are for being present with. And she was present, she was listening, and it was sufficient. Constance turned from the window. Her eyes moved across the room and found the sewing box on the lower shelf of the side table, beside a piece of folded knitting, and she reached for it without deliberation. It was an old box, walnut she believed, with a small rose carved into the lid, its metal hinges greened slightly with age, the wood dark and warm at the corners, where decades of handling had polished away what the maker had left. She opened the lid, and the box presented itself in its usual order, needles tucked into a small velvet cushion, thread in several colors wound onto their spools, a brass thimble that had been her mother's and fit Constance's finger as though the same measurement had been taken, a small pair of scissors, a length of tape, and several spare buttons of various sizes, which had accumulated over the years the way such things do in a house where nothing is discarded before its time. She looked at the box, and it returned her to her mother's dressmaking shop on the lower end of the lane. The bolts of cloth, the long table, the particular smell of new fabric and chalk, and something warm that always seemed to come from the cutting itself. Her mother, Mrs. Helena Whitfield, had been a precise and exacting woman, whose warmth lived not in her expression, but in her actions, which were consistently and quietly generous. Constance had been allowed in the shop from childhood, first to watch and then to assist, and had sewn her first stitch at 10, crooked, uneven, far too loose. Her mother had examined it for a moment in silence. Then she had said, without cruelty, "Unpick it and try again." And Constance had, and again, until the stitch was straight and firm and held. She had carried that instruction her whole life, not as a memory of failure, but as a principle, one of the few she had ever considered entirely reliable. The first attempt is rarely the right one. You unpick it, you try again. Patience is not waiting. It is returning and returning and returning until the thing is right. Constance took a needle from the cushion and a spool of dark red thread and reached for a small piece of fabric she had set aside a few days earlier. A seam along the back of the armchair's cover had begun to give, and she had meant to attend to it before it widened. It was a small repair, 10 minutes' work at most, but her hands appreciated having an occupation on evenings when her thoughts moved toward depth, and the act of mending, the physical immediacy of it, the needle and the cloth and the small resistance of the stitch kept her anchored in the present with a reliability that thinking alone could not provide. Hands, she had often thought, are where the present lives. Threading the needle took 2 attempts tonight. Her eyes were not what they had been at 30, but the second attempt succeeded, and she tied a small, neat knot at the end of the thread and began. The needle went in, a faint sound, barely there, the whisper of metal through cloth. The thread pulled through, and again, and again. The rhythm established itself quickly, a slow, regular motion, as meditative as breath, as the tide and Constance's thoughts followed the rhythm downward, quieting, spreading thin, losing their urgency until what remained was only the small, warm circle of the lamp's light, the cloth between her fingers, the movement of the needle, the passage of the thread. Everything else drew back. The room simplified itself. This was what she had always loved about sewing, not the making or the mending, but the quality of presence it required, absolute, uncomplicated, here. When the last stitch was in, she snipped the thread with the small scissors, turned the fabric over to examine the seam, and found it straight and firm. Her mother would have nodded, she thought. She folded the cloth and returned it to the chair back, closed the sewing box with its familiar small click, and rested her hands in her lap. At her fingertips, a memory of the thread's tension, a faint ghost of pressure, already fading. Work done, completely done. There was a particular satisfaction in that, she thought, not in achievement, but in completion, a thing begun and finished. The world had this one less small imperfection in it. It was modest as satisfactions went, and genuine as any she had known. The stove had quietly given up its heat without announcing it, and the room had cooled in the way rooms do when you aren't watching, gradually, without drama, until the cold is simply present. Constance rose, went to the stove, and opened the small iron door. A few coals still held their orange hearts, not gone yet, only reduced, burning on reserve. She took the poker and stirred them gently, turning up the heat that remained. Added a small handful of kindling from the basket beside the hearth, thin sticks and a twist of old paper. Leaned close and blew, carefully, steadily, coaxing, not forcing. The kindling took a bright, brief flame, and she fed it 2 pieces of coal, slowly giving the new fire room to establish itself before asking more of it. The iron began to warm almost immediately, and the warmth extended into the room, finding the air near the floor first and rising. She held her hands near the stove's side for a moment, not touching it, feeling the heat on her palms. She thought of Arthur's letter, "You are a kind of sorceress with fire," and allowed herself quietly to agree. There was a technique to it, yes, but the technique was only the outer form of something else, an attention, a patience, a willingness to work with the fire's own nature rather than against it. Much could be learned from that, she thought. Most things in the end were like fire. They responded to patience far better than to force. Constance went to the window one final time for the last look of the evening and stood before the glass and looked out at Harbor Lane. The town was asleep. The cobblestones lay empty and dark and still, the street lamps making their amber circles in the void, and between the circles the dark was dense and deep. The moon moved in the sky overhead, crossing its clear gap between the clouds, and the sea, visible in its narrow silver strip between the rooftops, lay quiet under the moonlight, impossibly still from this distance, though she knew it was never still. She thought, standing there, about the life she had lived in this window, in this town, for 62 years. No large adventures, no histories. She had not seen the wider world. She had not sought it. She was a seamstress, a postman's wife, a quiet resident of a small street in a small town on the edge of a country that mostly did not know she existed, and yet her life had been full to its particular measure, which was not the measure of remarkable things, but of noticed things, tended to things, a lamp's color, a bowl of soup, a letter from Bath, a rose that opened every summer without being asked, an impression left in the cushion of a wide brown chair. These were her inventory. She had kept them carefully, and looking out now at the sleeping lane, and the moon, and the strip of silver sea, she thought that if happiness had a shape, it was probably something like this: a room that is warm, and a window to look out from, and the knowledge that what you have been given has not been wasted. Arthur's absence was not a hole in her life. She had believed it was once, but it was not. It was a presence of a different kind, the presence of everything that had been, settled into the permanent past, solid and unchangeable, and therefore safe. 30 years of shared evenings, of tea and silence, and walking in the rain and arguing about fire. They had happened. They were beyond alteration now. They were hers completely, stored in the self the way roots store water, available in all weathers. She was grateful. She was genuinely, consistently, quietly grateful for the years, for the memory, and even for the loss, which had taught her things about the weight and worth of an ordinary life that she did not think she could have learned another way. She looked at the lamp on the ledge. It would stay. It always stayed, through the night, until morning, or until it ran down, whichever came first. Lighting it was not a decision she made each evening. It was simply part of what the evening was. When the clock struck 9, 9 measured notes in the quiet room, Constance knew the day was done, not by the sound alone, but by something in her body, a familiar heaviness at the corners of her eyes, a yielding sensation in her shoulders, a softening at the edges of thought. The body had its own knowledge of when enough had been enough, and she had learned, over 6 decades, to trust it. She looked around the room once more, the lamp, the 2 chairs, the clock on the mantelpiece, the familiar geography of objects that had been in exactly these places for so long that their arrangement felt not like a choice anyone had made, but like a natural fact. This constancy was its own comfort. Whatever the world was, outside on the wet lane, beyond the dark of the harbor, out past the silver strip of sea, this room was what it was. It had been what it was for 40 years. It would be what it was tomorrow. There was a steadiness in that which asked for no examination, and provided simply for what it was worth, steadiness itself. She went to the window for a last glance, the moon sailing through its gap, the lamps burning below, Harbor Lane at rest, and was satisfied. She rose from her chair slowly, feeling the full length of the day in her bones now, not an unpleasant sensation, but an honest one, and stood for a moment in the center of the room before turning toward the door. The lamp on the window ledge she left. The small lamp on the side table she turned low rather than extinguishing. She would sleep, and the lamp might or might not outlast her. It did not greatly matter. A small light at the heart of the house. The corridor received her 6 steps, the familiar creak of the 3rd floorboard, the 3 frames on the wall passing at the corner of her vision, in their order, the town, the mother, the empty frame. She did not stop. The empty frame held its own counsel tonight, as always. At the end of the corridor, the bedroom door. She opened it, the hinges speaking their single low note, and stepped through. The bedroom was lit only by the moon, which lay across the bed in a cool oblique panel, turning the white sheets silver. After the sitting room's amber warmth, this light felt different, quieter, more purely nocturnal, the kind of light that has no interest in helping you see, only in being what it is. Constance's feet registered the change from the corridor's bare boards to the bedroom's thicker carpet, softer, warmer, enveloping, and the difference told her body something her mind had already decided. The day was behind her. The night had her now. The room was small and spare. The iron-framed bed, the wardrobe, the washstand, the nursing chair in the corner where the moonlight did not reach. The bed was dressed in white sheets, dark blue wool blanket, the down coverlet that had kept her warm through 30 winters. Simple and sufficient. On the bedside table, a stub of candle, less than half remaining, a glass of water, and Arthur's pocket watch. The watch no longer ran. Its mainspring had failed years ago, and she had never had it repaired, though she could not have said precisely why. It sat on the table each night, in its open case, the hours frozen at 12 minutes past 3, the gears stilled, the chain coiled beside it. It was no longer a timepiece. It was something else, a held thing, an object that remembered being held by other hands, that had spent years in a coat pocket against a warm body, measuring the days of a life that had since stopped being measured. She kept it because she chose to. That was sufficient reason. She lit the candle with a match from the box on the washstand, and the room gained a second quality of light, the moon's silver and the candle's gold, existing in the same small space, each illuminating a different surface, the room existing in the overlap between them. She looked at herself briefly in the small mirror on the wardrobe door. The combined light was not unkind, but it was honest. She saw the lines that had accumulated on her face over the years, the particular lines around the eyes from a life of detailed work in variable light, the lines at the corners of the mouth from 50 years of expressions she no longer remembered making, the one vertical line between the brows that had arrived sometime in her 40s and stayed. She looked at the map of it, because that was what a face was, she thought after a certain number of years, not a surface, but a record. Every line a road, every road a story, and this was her map. She had no quarrel with it. She let her hair down, coiling the white weight of it over her shoulder, and drew the brush through it in long, slow strokes, the bristles against the scalp, the faint resistance of the length of it, the rhythm of the thing, repetitive and calming. Each stroke released something, the tension of sustained attention, the small accumulated weight of thought, the last residue of the days being awake. She counted the strokes without meaning to, because the body falls into counting when the mind relaxes. She put on her nightgown, white cotton, long, soft from washing, familiar against her skin, and the brief cool of the cloth on her arms before her warmth reclaimed it was its own small transition, one more threshold crossed. Before going to bed, Constance opened the bedside drawer and took out the photograph. Arthur, in formal dress, taken in a studio in Dorchester in what must have been the 1870s, seated, very upright, his hands resting in his lap with the careful self-consciousness of a man unused to being still and observed simultaneously. He was looking straight at the camera with an expression that was serious, but not severe. The seriousness was the studio's requirement. The warmth was his, present despite himself in the very slight softening at the corners of his eyes, the way a person's character will come through, even in formal circumstances, particularly in the eyes. This was not, she knew, his real face. His real face was the one that appeared when he was laughing at something he found unexpectedly funny, or struggling with a fire he could not get to draw, or reaching across the table to pass her something without looking up from the book he was reading. The photograph did not hold any of that, but it held enough. It held the shape of him, and each night she looked at it for a moment, and it was a form of contact, the best available form, which is rarely the ideal form, but which is nonetheless real and valuable. "Good night," she said, very quietly, her lips barely moving, not to the photograph, exactly, to the person behind it, who was also behind everything, behind the empty chair, behind the letters in the drawer, behind the lamp that burned each evening in the window. She returned the photograph gently to the drawer and slid it closed. She sat on the edge of the bed and the springs gave their familiar low complaint under her weight, a sound she had been hearing for so many years that its absence, she imagined, would wake her. She swung her legs up, lay back against the pillow, and drew the blanket up to her chin, and then the coverlet over that. The sheets were cool at first, a thin current of cold that found her ankles, her feet, the backs of her knees, but the cold was brief. Within seconds, her own warmth was working, and the chill became comfort, the way things do when they give way. The mattress held her in its familiar concavity, the slight softening at the center where she had slept for 40 years. The particular give of the springs in the particular arrangement she knew without thinking. The bed knew her weight. She knew the bed's yield. There was a companionship in that, inanimate and genuine. She put her head back on the pillow, and it shaped itself around the weight of her skull, gathering at the sides, rising to meet her ears, and the sound of the room deepened and softened all at once. She drew a slow breath, all the way in, feeling the expansion of it, and let it go, all the way out, unhurried. Again, the breath slower each time. The body understanding, beginning its own nightly process of relinquishment, starting at the places where tension lived, her shoulders, releasing her arms, settling her hands, uncurling her back, each vertebra finding its accommodation against the mattress, her legs growing heavy, her feet still. The candle burned on the bedside table, its small flame reflected in the glass of the water beside it. The moonlight lay across the bed, and in the sitting room down the corridor, the lamp still burned on the window ledge. She knew it without seeing it, could feel its continued presence the way one feels any enduring thing, with certainty, without needing confirmation. Her eyes were open, looking at the candle, at the way the flame moved in some air current too slight to feel. Then half open, the flame softened at its edges. The room grew comfortable with blur. She did not resist it. The thoughts came slowly now, without urgency, drifting through at whatever pace they chose, like clouds using a sky they had all to themselves. Tomorrow the lamp would be lit again. Tomorrow the tea would be made, the street watched, the evening had. She knew this, and the knowledge rested easy. There was something deeply reassuring about a life organized around such certainties, not grand certainties, not certainties of meaning or purpose or ultimate direction, but the humble, reliable certainty of tomorrow's cup and tomorrow's lamp and tomorrow's window. Whether the sun came out or whether it rained again, or whether the sky did something she had never seen before in 62 years, it would all be met from the same chair, through the same glass, with the same tea in hand, and this sameness was not limitation, it was continuity. It was the shape that care makes when it decides to stay. Arthur drifted through, as he did each night, not as memory now, not as loss. The day had already done its work with both, but simply as presence, a warmth in the room of the mind, a known and familiar weight, comfortable as the mattress, as the blanket, as the sound of the tide coming in. She did not hold the thought. She let it pass through and be what it was, the faint gold of the lamp, the smell of tea, the sound of rain, the face in the drawer, the imprint in a chair, and all of it gathered quietly, without distinction, into the general warmth and darkness of the moment. And she thought, perhaps this is what enough looks like, not triumph, not arrival, not even happiness in its acute form, but this, a warm room, a life attended to with care, the people loved, and the objects kept, and the small rituals observed, the window open every evening to the street below, the lamp burning for no one and everyone, and mostly just because she did not blow out the candle. It would manage itself. It had been managing itself for some time, and Constance slept, deeply and with the particular quality of rest that belongs to those who have spent the day in honest work and the evening in honest reflection, a sleep with no resistance in it, a sleep that the body enters without argument, as into something it was made for. Her face held very slightly an expression that a passing stranger might have called contentment. The candle burned on for a few minutes more and then extinguished itself quietly, as promised. Down the corridor, The lamp on the window ledge continued. It cast its warm amber light through the glass and onto the wet cobblestones of Harbor Lane, and Harbor Lane received it, and was lit, and was quiet. The town lay around it in its own long sleep, each house with its dark windows, each window holding its dark interior, each interior holding its dreaming life. The moon moved on through its clear gap in the clouds. The sea attended to its own endless work against the shore below, and everything, the lane, the houses, the sleeping town, the patient sea, the moving sky, everything was as it was, and as it had been, and as it would continue to be, indifferent to observation, requiring nothing, complete. And now, just as Constance has come to the end of her day, so have you. Whatever the day held, long or short, difficult or kind, full or empty, it is finished. You do not need to return to it. There is nothing it still requires of you. Let it go. It knows the way. Feel your body where it is, the weight of your head in the pillow, the place where the sheets meet your skin, the warmth that has gathered around you since you lay down. Nothing needs adjusting. Nothing needs attending to. You are exactly where you should be. Breathe in slowly, all the way, and let it go, even more slowly. And again, each breath a little slower, each one a little more complete. Let your shoulders release, and your arms grow heavy, and your hands uncurl. Let your back settle deeper. Let your legs find their place. One by one, every part of you is permitted to stop holding. Like the lamp in Constance's window, there is something burning quietly nearby, whatever warmth it is that watches over you. You are inside it. You are held inside the warmth of this night, inside the walls of wherever you are, inside the dark that is not threatening, but simply the world with its lights dimmed, resting as you rest. Let your thoughts slow. Let them come and go as they will, drifting in like tide, drawing back, replaced by others, which also draw back. You are not required to follow any of them. They know their way out. Simply watch them go, and let the spaces between them widen. If you like, imagine a window, a small lamplit window on a cobbled street, the glass slightly fogged, the light within amber and still. The lane below is quiet. The sea is somewhere beyond the rooftops. The rain has stopped. Everything that can sleep is sleeping. And that small lamp burns on, patient, faithful, warm for no special reason, and for all the best reasons. Let its light reach you. Let it be the last thing you think of, if you think of anything at all. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep without hurry. The night is long and safe and generous, and morning will come as it always has. But not yet. Now there is only this, the dark, the warmth, the sound of the sea, the small patient light. You are safe, you are well, you are here, and that is enough. Good night.